For me, writing is the ultimate art form because a good piece of writing can reach in and grip your soul and wrench you apart like a movie or a song rarely can. Some works of literature are so good at this. Once you read them, you often can't sleep, you can't think, you can barely breathe. Such is the gravity of their content. And I want to talk today about 3 books that are very special to me, absolutely shook me to my soul. Now, the first book I want to talk about is this here. It's Endurance by Alfred Lansing. And this is a phenomenal piece of non-fiction writing. There's been a recent book about the boat, the Endurance, which took Ernest Shackleton to the South Pole. And it's the story of how they discovered that boat. And that's an adventure in itself. This here, Alfred Lansing's book, is the ultimate adventure book. This is a story from a truly heroic age of exploration. Ernest Shackleton and his crew on the boat, the Endurance, are attempting to go from one edge to the other of Antarctica. And just about everything that can go wrong does go wrong in this expedition. And it is unbelievably cruel. The ferocity of nature in that part of the world is outstandingly ferocious. Lansing's writing just brings alive how uncaring nature really is. The account is constructed from the actual diaries of the men that were there. And there is some truly harrowing stuff in here. We're talking weeks and weeks at sea on a vessel that should have no business in the harshest and most terrible seas in the world. One of the most remarkable things about this text is how Lansing characterises the ice as the ultimate villain. The ice, it never rests, it never sleeps, it is completely uncaring, and there is nothing they can do to prevent it. If the ice so decided to crush the boat and kill all of them, there'd be very little they can do, and for most part, there is very little they can do. What's happening to them is truly desperate. Their chances of survival are extremely limited. Their spirit is almost entirely unbreakable. And there might be some revisionist history going on here, but their diary entries themselves show this incredible strength of character. And at times, the book is almost joyful, and it's a somewhat positive message, one that we can learn a lot from, and I think the reason why this book has become so well regarded. So why does it shake me to my soul? And that's because as an adult, I can truly appreciate how difficult those circumstances in. A couple of years ago, I ran a ultramarathon. I ran 100 kilometers, and I remember the last 10 kilometers of that race being one of the worst things I'd ever done. And that pales in comparison to what these men went through and the sheer length of time they went through it. I mean, we're talking about years of incredible fortitude in one of the harshest environments in the world. And that really is amazing. This is a really fascinating, exciting and exhilarating tale of the indomitable human spirit. It is well worth your time. Next, I want to talk about a book that was so harrowing that I couldn't read it in the dark. And that is Cormac McCarthy's The Road. Now, if you've heard of McCarthy's sort of magnus opus, which is Blood Meridian, then this is a much easier introduction to his style of writing. McCarthy's writing is sparse, it uses very little punctuation, and the dialogue is not separated by any sort of quotation marks or attributions, which can make Blood Meridian quite difficult to read at times. This has the same, though it's a much easier read. The Road is the story of a father and son in a post-apocalyptic world. The whole world is burnt to a crisp, and it's not explained why or how, though we can assume that it has something to do with either an environmental disaster of colossal scale or maybe a nuclear war. It is a frightful and honest retelling of the sort of things that you might face while travelling the road in such a world. They're heading south because the weather is closing in, the winter will kill them. Obviously, so is everybody else. And it is absolutely harrowing. I mean, his depictions of some of the worst elements of human nature are, for fiction, so realistic and so lifelike that you can't help but think that is actually how people would happen. There is horrific cannibalism occurring, barbaric practices which they encounter. The ability for Cormac to build tension in this book is unbelievable. I think one of the reasons why this book really touched me is because their position is ultimately completely hopeless. There is so much ash in the atmosphere, and the fires are still raging in places that, there's no ability to grow food or, recover. In fact, there are so few people left that they're not really sure at times how many people still live. As they travel, it becomes clear to you, the reader, that they are effectively hopeless. Why continue? And you can't help but ask yourself, if you were in the same situation, would you continue? Would you keep fighting? You know, their struggle is so barbaric and so intense. It's incredibly difficult for them just to survive. For what? And for what end? This is a sensational piece of writing. I actually prefer it to Blood Meridian because it's much more accessible. I highly recommend that you give it a read, though be warned, it may keep you up at night. In fact, the cover to my copy of The Road, one of the worst passages in The Road, just to give you an idea of what this novel's like and how it just slaps you in the face with a sort of human brutality. There's one sequence where they're walking and they see that some people have a fire in the woods off the road. They go to approach because they're starving and they need help, and this is all the chance they've got. The people that are around this fire immediately flee. They run away. And you're thinking, well, if they run, that is a sign that maybe they're the good guys, because the bad guys might stay and try to kill you. You know, that's what you think, right? They go to this campfire, and when they get there, they suddenly realise that these people are not cooking any normal meal, cooking a human baby. From the Times, it says, a work of such terrible beauty that you will struggle to look away. And I think that says it better than I ever could. And the last work that I want to talk about is the Gulag Archipelago. And I'm going to butcher this name, I'm really sorry. It's Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Now, the Gulag Archipelago, if you've never heard of this, it's a non-fiction written by a man who spent much of his life in the gulags of Soviet Russia for a arbitrary political crime. And the writing of this piece of work is as impressive as the piece of work itself. Now, I should note that the full unabridged Gulag Archipelago is extremely long, and I've read it, thousands of pages, and there is a abridged version of this book, and you should read the abridged version because the extended version is incredibly repetitive at times. And there is a reason why it's repetitive, and that's because, and this is the most insane story, is that, you know, the author is inside the gulags writing this on scraps of papers, hiding it on his persons over the course of decades, and then it has to be smuggled out of Russia before it can find widespread publication. It's popularly credited with part of the reason why the West suddenly stopped dealing with the Russians and the Soviet regime as equal partners. I read the full unabridged version of this book over the course of about 4 months. That's how long it takes to read, and I was reading it fairly religiously. And I remember after I finished reading it, I was in this very confused and sort of deep depression. I was thinking about my mortality all the time, and I couldn't figure out quite why I'd been suddenly afflicted by that. And I think it was because I just spent 4 months reading about such a casual disregard for human life. People die in the gulags like they are nothing. Human life is completely disrespected. It is an incredibly brutal and disheartening regime that is designed to dehumanize and destroy lives. There is a section in the first volume of the book where Solzhenitsyn describes the types of torture which are used to extract information from people. I kid you not, it is like a 75-point bullet list that goes on for pages. This work hides nothing. It does not condense or summarize the information. It is the sheer weight of the amount of information that you're given that makes it entirely believable. And that is truly harrowing. You know, I think Jordan Peterson once said about the Gulag Archipelago that, like, reading it was like going into a boxing ring, and I completely agree. It is one of the hardest things you'll ever read, but also one of the most important things you'll ever read.